Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We've got some really cool excerpts to dive into today from Ideology and Empire in 18th century India.
Ooh, yeah, this one's going to be good.
Looks like we're going to be uncovering how the British East India Company, how they drew all these parallels between their expanding power in 18th century Bengal
Okay.
and the Mughal Empire.
Yeah. You know what's really fascinating about all this?
What's that?
Is how the British, they tried to make their rule seem totally legit
Okay.
by claiming they were upholding like an ancient Mughal constitution.
An ancient Mughal constitution.
Yeah, like they just stumbled upon some, forgotten legal system, just waiting for them to come along and enforce it.
That's pretty wild. So
It's a pretty clever move.
we're starting with the East India Company,
Yep.
which started as a trading company back in the 1600s, right?
Exactly.
But then things took a pretty dramatic turn in the 1750s and 60s.
Yeah, things really started to shift. You had the Mughal Empire weakening, and the company already had a pretty strong military presence,
Yeah.
And they started just taking territory,
Wow.
particularly in Bengal.
Bengal.
By the 1770s, you have this small group of British officials and their army basically running the whole show in Bengal.
So going from merchants to rulers like that
It's a huge change.
must have raised some eyebrows back in Britain.
Oh, absolutely. It
No.
definitely did.
How did they even try to explain that?
Well, they had this concept they called the ancient constitution.
Ancient constitution.
It was this idea that their system of government, in Britain, was
Right.
rooted in all these ancient customs and rites.
Interesting.
And they were desperate to find something similar in Bengal
I see.
to make this whole takeover seem less like,
A takeover.
Exactly.
So they decided to look to the Mughals for this.
Yeah, that's where they turned.
But how do you apply a British concept like ancient constitution
Right.
to a totally different society like Mughal India?
Well, that is where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
What the British did was they cherry-picked certain parts of Mughal history and their system of government,
Okay.
things that fit their narrative, you know?
I see.
Like, they pointed to emperors like Akbar, who
Oh.
was famous for tolerance and all his
Yeah.
reforms, to
Nice.
argue that they were just continuing a tradition of just and efficient rule.
Clever. But how much truth was there to that?
Well, that's the question, isn't it? It seems like they were kind of reinterpreting history to fit their own agenda.
Yeah, it sounds like it.
Good.
Okay, so we have the declining Mughal Empire
Right.
and the East India Company both vying for control.
Yeah.
But you mentioned that Calcutta played a key role even before these big conquests happened.
Absolutely.
What was going on in Calcutta at that time?
Calcutta in the 1750s was this incredible mix of British and Mughal influences.
Really?
Yeah. The company, they had all these rights and privileges
Yeah.
from both the Mughal emperors and the British monarchs.
So they were playing both sides.
In a way, yeah. Calcutta had a governor and a council,
Mhm.
and they had to answer to the company's directors in London.
Right.
But also, they had to navigate the complex world of Mughal politics.
Wow, it sounds like a real balancing act.
Oh, it definitely was.
How did that even work in practice?
Well, get this. Company officials actually held the title of Zamindar.
Damindar.
Yep. They were collecting taxes
Wow.
and administering justice, just like the local Indian rulers did.
Huh.
But at the same time,
Right.
they were also getting instructions from London
Right.
and had to make sure English law was followed within their settlements.
So it was this really hybrid system,
Yeah.
a mix of British and Mughal authority.
Precisely. And I think this whole experience in Calcutta,
Yeah.
this having to reconcile all these different systems of power,
Right.
I think it really foreshadowed how the company would later try to legitimize its rule all across Bengal
Wait.
by using this idea of an ancient Mughal constitution.
That's a great point. It's like they had a trial run in Calcutta
Yeah.
before applying that same strategy on a larger scale.
Exactly. It's fascinating how that all played out. It's amazing how they tried to make it all fit, this
Yep.
aligning with these existing power structures.
Right.
It's like they were testing the waters with this in Calcutta.
Yeah, like a trial run.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got this mix of British and Mughal influences in Calcutta.
Right.
But how did this so-called ancient Mughal constitution actually work?
Mm.
What did they actually do?
Well, we have to remember that the British had their own agenda.
Right.
It wasn't about preserving Mughal traditions.
Right.
They wanted a system that worked for them,
Okay.
primarily economic exploitation and control.
Control disguises continuity.
Exactly. One example is the revenue system.
Okay.
The Mughals had a complex system, for tax collection based on land ownership and agriculture production. The British claimed they were upholding this, but what they really did was implement policies that got them the most revenue.
I see.
Often this led to overtaxation and hardship for the local people.
It sounds like they were manipulating things to their advantage.
Yeah.
Did they even try to understand the nuances of Mughal law and governance, or were they just imposing their own ideas?
That's a really good question. I mean, they did try to study Mughal legal codes and administrative practices, but their interpretation was always seen through a British lens. They focused on parts that reinforced their authority and ignored the parts that didn't.
So a very selective understanding.
Exactly. Driven by their own goals. Another example is the judicial system.
Okay.
The Mughals had this system based on Islamic law and local customs.
Okay.
The British said they would respect it, but slowly they started adding English common law and made separate courts for Europeans.
Really?
Yeah, this created a dual system that favored British interests.
Wow, so they were creating a parallel system that chipped away at the existing power structures.
Exactly, and that created resentment among many Indians.
Yeah.
They felt that the British weren't really committed to their traditions. This tension would eventually lead to resistance against the British.
So it seems like this ancient constitution wasn't really about the past. It was about justifying their present actions.
Exactly. It was a clever strategy, but only in theory. It had a shaky foundation and was full of contradictions. And as we'll see in the next part of our deep dive, this strategy was really challenged when a famine hit Bengal in the 1770s. This exposed the limits of this so-called ancient constitution and really raised questions about whether British rule was legitimate.
So this whole ancient Mughal constitution idea, it seems like a pretty bold claim.
It is.
Especially when a major crisis hits. You mentioned that devastating famine in Bengal in the 1770s. How did that impact this whole narrative of continuity and legitimacy that the British had built?
Well, the Bengal famine of 1770 was a huge humanitarian catastrophe. Millions of people died because of drought-failed crops. And crucially, the East India Company's policies.
Wait, so the company's actions made the famine worse?
Yeah.
How?
Well, remember how we talked about how the company was all about maximizing revenue? Even during the famine, they kept demanding those high taxes from the people of Bengal.
Really?
Yeah, and they also prioritized sending grain to other parts of their empire.
Oh, wow.
This depleted the local food supplies even more.
So it seems like their economic interests were more important than the people.
Yeah, it really does seem that way.
The people they were supposed to be governing.
Right, and the famine exposed the flaws in this ancient Mughal constitution idea. If the British were really upholding this tradition of just and benevolent rule, how could they let this happen?
Yeah, it's like their carefully constructed facade crumbled.
It did.
Under this crisis.
Exactly. The famine became a turning point in how people saw British rule in Bengal. It raised questions about their competence, their motives, and the legitimacy of their claims.
Did the British try to address these criticisms at all?
They did make some reforms, but they were seen as too little too late. And they kept justifying their actions by saying they were acting in accordance with this ancient constitution.
Wow, even though the reality was completely different.
Exactly.
So they kept pushing that narrative, even though it was hard to believe.
It was.
Given what was happening to the Bengali people.
Right.
So the Bengal famine really showed the limitations of this ancient constitution idea.
It did.
And it showed how it could be manipulated, even if it meant people were suffering.
It's a reminder to be critical of how history is used, especially when it's used to justify power.
That's a great point.
History is not just facts and dates. It can be shaped and reshaped.
That's so true.
For different purposes.
Well, this has been a fascinating deep dive into a complex period of history.
Absolutely.
This idea of an ancient constitution reveals so much about power and ideology and the clash of cultures.
For sure.
It really shows how important it is to examine history critically.
It is.
And to recognize that even narratives that seem benevolent can have hidden motives.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining us on this journey.
It was my pleasure.
And keep questioning, keep exploring.
Yeah.
Keep those aha moments coming.